So I'll turn it over to the chief, who will be filling in for Mr. Feuerborn tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First of all, Mr. Feuerborn sends his apologies. He would much rather be here with you all tonight than in the mediation downtown. But I think they may be there many, many more hours into the night trying to get all of that settled. He did want to make sure, as the folks from Morning View have the opportunity to go through the proposal, that I've had the opportunity, sort of on the fly, but had the opportunity to confer with Mr. Feuerborn, Mr. Carteret, and Mr. Icky, I'm sorry, Mr. Crass, too many mics, and Mr. Crass with regard to all of the stipulations that the Morning View folks will be talking about tonight. So I'm at least somewhat prepared to address any questions that you all might have as they go through their presentation. So I'll turn that over to them.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. So we thank you people for giving us the opportunity to appear here tonight. We want to thank you very much for that. Got a little bit of a slide presentation we'd like to go through. If any of you have any questions as we do go through this, I'd appreciate maybe making a note of them, and then we'll try to answer them at the end of the presentation as we go through. Up there on the board, a little bit of a background to our Morning View subdivision. We have 191 homes in our subdivision there. 85% of the residents are on fixed incomes. 70% of them are single women that are 70 years of age and older. 82% of our residents voted for the dedication of our streets to the city. And our residents are also strong participants in all of the elections that we have in our community there. See if I get this right. Okay, this is kind of a quick overview of the streets in Morning View. This was kind of phase one. It shows there where the activity center is right here, which is on Sunrise Street there. So the south side of the bottom of that would be Sunrise in there. This was kind of the next one. That street there is Saturn that you see coming along here and turning up here on that. And then this is the next phase that's in there, like with Poseidon Street, that then comes off of across Sunrise and goes on. And then this is the last phase that occurred. It is essentially at the southwest corner of J Highway and Sunrise in there. So that kind of give you a quick overview of our streets out there and how they lay out on there. In connection with our streets, and this, we've been in discussions with Mr. Crass, our Public Works Director, and Mr. Feuerborn, and also Mr. Zur, the attorney, over our streets and the dedication thereof for several months, going back into last year. Mr. Crass has given our streets a satisfactory rating as per the guidelines that the council adopted in January. Therefore, the city should not have to spend little, if any, money on the streets in the near term. The sidewalks in our community are the only ones that are there are on Sunrise. I got sunshine up there. Sorry about that. So there's no other sidewalks in Morning View, so there's nothing to be done there in terms of ADA access or those kinds of things throughout the rest of the subdivision. Also because of where Google Fiber laid their cables and boxes, et cetera, and the size of our lots, we would opt out of the Operation Sidewalk kind of thing that's been discussed a couple times with Ms. Abdelgawad and Mr. Berenson there. We think that would probably save an estimated $200,000 plus of a future expenditure there. Our street signs and sidewalk or stop signs are up and in good shape. Thus, no expenditure would have to be required, as it pertains to the streets in there. Street lights, we have 19 street lights in Morning View that are already there, operational and working. Thus, no cost to the city to have to ever come in and put in any more street lights. Based on what it would amount to a replacement cost, that would be a value of about $114,000. So that's money that would not have to be spent. In addition, the guidelines that you adopted in January call for like street lights to be on a separate meter. Our lights are already on a separate meter, so it already meets that part of the guidelines as relates, to being taken over by the city in there. On our curbs, Mr. Crass and staff have reviewed our curbs and have determined at this point that they estimate 5,600 feet of curbing that would need to be replaced. One of the issues that comes into play there is the style of curb that might have to be there. There's currently a city ordinance, as I understand it, that requires high-back curbs, on any future things in there. Right now, all of our curbs are what they call low-back in there, and as I'll show you in a couple of minutes, there's about 154 transitions, so the curbs that need to be replaced are not contiguous kind of thing. It's going to be a start-stop, 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 kind of situation. So depending on, what might happen and what we might have to do there on the style of curb, that would, affect our cost. If we continue with the low-back curbs, we estimate that there will be approximately $200,000 to $215,000 cost to replace that 5,600 feet of curbing in there. We have entered into a preliminary contract with a company called Steve Williams Paving and Asphalt to repair the curbs. And as soon as, let's say, assuming, I'm doing a little bit of assuming here, that if the council approves our petition and it passes a resolution accepting that, as soon as that happens, he's ready to start work. So depending on weather and some of the things we can't control, he's ready to start work and work on them until they are finished. So it wouldn't be something that would get drug out for months and months and months, as we go down the road. In the, this is like where you see the red lines in here. Those are the areas of curbing that city staff has said need to be replaced. And so you can see how it starts, stop, and some places where there's kind of a double dash in there, like right there, and up here, that means there's a start, a stop, a few feet, and starts in again on there. And on this particular street segment here, there's 22 transitions that occur in that place there. On this particular street and segment there's 8 transitions that would occur. And on this particular picture, there are 20 transitions that would occur. And on the rest of the streets that would be the 5,600 feet that would be involved, there's actually 154, whoops, go back one here. There's actually 154 of those kinds of transitions. So that's one of the reasons we would ask the city to waive in some form or fashion going to the high back curbs, because you're going to have 154 transitions of high back, low back, and that creates quite a problem and a scenario for walking and transitions and future repair work that might need to be done there. So that's kind of what's involved in that on there. Financing. This is where Morning View needs your help. Here, a couple of things in there. One, the waiver of the high back curbs. If not, that adds about $34,000 to our cost that I showed you just a second ago on that other slide as to what would come involved in there. Morning View would contract with the contractor. That would eliminate some issues, thus keeping our project costs down. Morning View this year would pay $65,000 of the obligation to the city. We are suggesting we would make that payment on September the 10th. The city would pay Morning View the check to pay the contractor within 30 days after completion, and we would ask that we could pay off the balance in 10 equal annual installments in each succeeding September 10th. That, in a quick nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, is kind of where we are and what we're asking for there. So at this point, if you have any questions, we would stand ready to try to answer those and resolve those.
Well, that's a lot to absorb, but I know that the staff has met and said that the concession for the rollback curb was a recommendation that they could concede to, that they understood that the transitions there would probably be too voluminous to really look right on that, but that if you're all willing to replace those curbs, we could proceed forward. Does the, I guess from our perspective, does the council wish to accept their financing proposal? That's something that we need to talk about with regard to the curbing. Mr. Holman?
Yeah, in regards to that, I do have a question. You quoted a figure somewhere around the top end of $200,000 roughly for the curb replacement, and then you talk about a payment of $65,000, and then so the bullet point F, it says you'll pay off the balance in 10 equal installments on September 10th of each year. So you're talking about 200,000 minus 65,000, whatever's left, that would be the
Yes.
the remaining 10 payments
Yes.
over a 10-year period. Okay.
Yes. We figure that if it, the one variable that kind of remains in there, of course, is when we're taking out the old curbs, et cetera, in there, is when that saw is cutting that if it, how much damage it might do to a driveway or to the asphalt that adjoins it, we don't know, it's hard to tell until they really get going, how much that might affect. But we've tried to build a number into that $200,000 to $225,000 that would cover that, so there wouldn't be any surprises on down the road that come back and say, well, it's 300, instead of the number we talked about tonight.
So assuming your number was correct, you'd be talking about 13,000 a year for 10 years, probably, something around that,
Yes.
that phase, okay.
Yes, and that's money, and we've been spending that kind of money already, kind of on our own, on our streets and things. So we've been maintaining them ever since 1990 when the subdivision first started.
That was another question I was going to pose to you. What's changed? You guys had the option, obviously, of coming into the city and having these city streets initially. What is different now? Why are you asking us to
I
do
think
this?
originally, and I can only conjecture a little bit, because there was a gentleman named Mr. Willis that started the subdivision, and I think part of it was that he just didn't want to come and comply, with some of the standards of the city.
Okay.
At that point, and as I was understand too, there's probably at one time even some bad blood. That because when Morning View got mentioned, the door got shut.
Okay.
Kind of thing. But we had the streets cored last fall, and as a result of that coring and as a result of staff physical inspection, they determined that the streets meet current standards for the city.
Okay.
Chief, did you have something to add to that?
I did, thank you, sir. Mr. Fearborn wanted to make sure that I conveyed to the council that the staff is good with the proposal that Morning View is making on the financing, with the understanding, and I know that Morning View understands that they'll be paying the city back in full, but that money will need to be taken out of our next year's curb replacement program, because obviously we'll be financing now this program instead of just curb replacement throughout the city. So we'll need to reduce our curb replacement by that amount going forward. And the fact that Morning View, I believe, has agreed that their contractor will do this install using city materials and following city construction standards. So,
Yes.
yeah, I think that's all been discussed. So Mr. Fearborn and the rest of city staff, both Mr. Carteret and Mr. Crass, we're in agreement with the financing proposal.
With the understanding that you all know that we're going to have to reduce that by that amount, because that'll be about $150,000 less that we would have available for next year, because once the project is done, if we have to pay that in total, then that'll be, their 65 and our 150 would mean that we'd have to reduce it by about that amount. Mr. Barber.
Yeah, I got a couple of comment and a question. Comment is, I drove through your neighborhood, and you guys have a beautiful neighborhood.
Thank you.
Very nice, very well maintained. Question is, you went out to bid for this curb replacement, and staff, I would looked at that as well. How did that line up with what we pay for a curb? We have spend a whole lot more than this every year on curb replacement. Is there anything that we could do from the city standpoint to get, maybe a better bid or a better deal from a, volume is always better? Just curious.
Mr. Crass didn't indicate in those conversations that they had actually looked at better bidding because they were going to allow the folks from Morning View to actually, make those arrangements for the replacement there. But that's certainly something that I can ask, Mr. Crass going forward perhaps before a decision is made by the council about moving forward.
Also, to further answer your question, the numbers that Mr. Crass used in estimating, from his standpoint, the estimated replacement cost of the 5,600 feet, he used a figure $32 and some change in there. And our current bid that we have from Mr. Steve Williams and his company is $30 a foot. So it's $2 and about 50 cents less per foot than what Mr. Crass had estimated.
Many budgets, yeah.
I guess I have another question, another comment. obviously, when somebody comes in and develops a neighborhood, when you buy your homes or buy the lots, you're paying for that infrastructure. So the curbs, the street, and the lights. You guys are also assessed taxes for your home, correct? And you've been paying for all this since the 90s, early 90s, but was your assessment any different as far as the city was concerned on how you were paying your taxes, or were you taxed just like I am and everybody else?
No,
Just curious.
no, our taxes have stayed the same. I mean, you know, it's so much per assessed, you know, $100 valuation, and that's what's been paid in there. In addition to that, the residents of Morning View currently pay $148 a month in dues, and out of that, we've currently been supplying snow removal, trash removal, mow the yards, paint their houses, replace dry rot. So we've been giving them a pretty good value for the money, as well as fixing the streets, you know, fixing curbs as we had the money, you know, to go along.
Mr. Abdelgawan.
Never mind.
Mr. Kellogg.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have several bullet points here, at least 6, and 4 of them were what I had before I came into the meeting. But the first one that I want to address is what was just said. In a question to staff, the Morning View has said that they are able and ready to go into an agreement with the contractor, and then we pay that off. Are we, the city, able to fulfill that agreement, even though that does not, we have not bid that out through our processes? That's my question there. That'd be my concern there. And I realize Jim isn't here, but would staff be able to research that and let me know that is a concern? Then I'll hold off on that and keep it around the subject that we're talking about, because I see Mr. Berenson have some comments too, so.
And let me say, any questions, because I think Mr. Feuerborn is actually watching us from somewhere, any questions that staff or any, thing that you all want to know that obviously I can't answer tonight, that we will be getting those answers back to all of you before this would ever go on an agenda.
Thank you. Mr. Berenson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First of all, for Councilman Kellogg, that is something that we did discuss, and we can talk about that later. I'd rather Jim explain it than myself, but we did discuss that, and we seem to think that there would be a way to do that legally and without any issues, and especially if their contractor can do it for less money. We also talked about, since there's 5,000 plus square foot of curb, somebody else had mentioned maybe getting a better buy on that, since we're buying so much in bulk, and we had talked about that too. And again, I think their contractor, that's kind of where they're getting their amount. They're $30 a square foot, a linear foot. And another comment too, Councilman Abdelgawan and I have worked with these folks now for 3 or 4 months. If you remember, the council set forth some pretty strict standards for taking over public infrastructure, and in our first meeting, that's one of the first things we talked about is, here's the criteria. And I want to commend them. They've been very good in communicating with us. They've followed the criteria that we've asked them to follow to a T. They've been a pleasure to work with, and I look forward to working with them, and I hope this goes through. I certainly support it, but they've been fantastic to work with, and I hope you guys will support them. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Abdelgawan.
And kind of dovetailing on that, we have worked extensively with this group from Morning View as we've been working through all of the steps in the process that we set for taking over infrastructure. I know that they've also worked closely with Mr. Crass, Mr. Feuerborn. They've had Jonathan and their own attorney working together, and they've worked really hard to try to sort out all the details and be sure that they meet all the requirements before they brought this back to us. I don't know if you guys remember, several months ago, they came and kind of introduced the idea, and that's when we said, yes, go ahead, here are the criteria, work out, your plan, and they've worked really hard on that. And in my opinion, like Mr. Berenson, it seems seems pretty flawless. They're asking us to give them a little bit, to give them that loan them the money, but they're going to pay back every penny of it. And they have a solid plan for that. They have money coming in. They have a budget set aside for that. So in my opinion, we're, not just in my opinion, factually, we're getting streets that are satisfactory. They're going to work to replace the curbs so that the curbs also meet the city requirements. The street lights, same thing. There's really, in my opinion now, there's really not much we can argue with here.
Also for this council's information, we have already set aside $40,000 of the $65,000 we're talking about to be paid back. So we're setting aside at least $10,000 every month out of our cash flow to be able to meet that obligation come September and not have to come to you hat in hand in September and say, we don't have the money. You know, we'll have the money, you know, there.
Mr. Barber.
Yeah, one more, not to complicate this, but the style of curbs and the sidewalks, I know we've done this in the past. We do, I think it's called like an overlay district, where we can say this area is exempt from that. Is this something that staff would recommend, or I think if this is going to be a decision and we go this route, maybe to keep from having to go back and constantly fighting City Hall on the curbs, that we go ahead and let's exempt them now.
Well, and as Mr. Fearborn had indicated, when you talk about the sidewalk gap program and the opportunity for Morning View to opt out of the sidewalk gap program going forward, that has been a decision that the council has made on a case-by-case basis in other neighborhoods. So, just food for thought, more than anything else, that, because the council has always done that on a case-by-case basis, opting out an entire neighborhood would be something different, something at least to consider going forward because of that, because of a change in the way that you all have done business in the past.
Go ahead.
The overlay district is actually something we've talked with Mr. Fearborn about, related to the sidewalks already. Like Original Town, they have the overlay district, and we had talked about that already. So I think that's kind of already in process, the plans to do that if this is all approved. Yeah, I think that's a great way to handle it.
Mr. Kellogg.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess where my concern is, and I've learned this from Jim, trust but verify, and I'm only going to verify by asking. I have no issues with entering into an agreement like this as long as the requirements that we as a council have set forth are being met. Just because we say they're curbs don't mean that they're the curbs that we put a policy into just a few years ago that increased the cost of our concrete. That's what I'm worried about, is that we have increased because the deterioration of curbs throughout the whole regional area, all the way over to Overland Park, Olathe, and all of that. I remember staff bringing back a report that this was a systemic problem region-wide because of the aggregate had deteriorated to the point that we were not getting the quality aggregate that we used to get 50 years ago. So we have put restrictions or requirements on ourselves for our own infrastructures that we use a certain type of aggregate, and that's the kind of details that I'm worried about when we don't have a control over the contract that was negotiated. That's kind of parallel through all of my concerns that I have written down here, on that. So I believe I need to say that.
Well, and as Mr. Crass and Mr. Fearborn had indicated, Councilman Kellogg, that exactly to your point, that they wanted to make sure that they use city materials and they use city construction standards, so that they would meet as if they were doing the install, the city was doing the install themselves. So it would absolutely meet those standards, both for materials and construction.
Mr. Burke.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was thinking, as far as an overlay that would change what would be done in the future when, say, the city replaces an entire street of curbage, I would not want to change those in the future. But primarily, one of the reasons that we wanted to have the high back curbs in the going forward in the future was to protect sidewalks. Well, if there's going to be an opt-out of sidewalks, that's a little bit of a different situation, because when people roll up and then park on the sidewalk, it's deteriorating our infrastructure in two ways. But if there's not a sidewalk, they're not going to roll up and park on a sidewalk that doesn't exist, and it would damage, you wouldn't damage intentionally your own yard. So I think doing the types of curbs that you're talking about now to make them all look the same would be appropriate. And then in the future, if an entire street was to be redone, then we'd do the high back at that time.
Mr. Ullman, did you have some?
Yeah, I concur with Mr. Burke's consensus. And as far as, to me, the overlay district is a separate issue. I would not be in favor of that, because I think we might change to high back later on, and then you're pinned down by an overlay. I think we can do the exemption for this and let them do the rollback now, like with what they have. I'm good with that, but I wouldn't want to put an overlaying standard on it at this point, especially just for one or two items. But and another reason we do the high back now as opposed to the rollback, Kevin's right, we use different aggregate, and then the high back takes less UV. It doesn't get hit as hard as that rollback does. There's more surface coming down. UV is hitting it harder. But separate issue. I had two questions, pretty simple. One, there's a note here in the packet about distribution of snow, and I think that's been addressed with you all. You people are good with, your association's good with the distribution of snow as we move it off past the curb line.
Yes, we are.
And then the other thing that was in here, perhaps a question for staff or a later time, but we would not have, or we will have as part of this agreement, easement or right-of-way access beyond the curb line. My question being, you have a huge majority of your people, 82%, that have voted for this, but that in the flip side of the coin means there's 18% that were not in agreement with it. What I would not want to see is for us to come on and do repairs to a street light and somebody going, hey, I didn't vote for this, you're trespassing on my property, and having an issue with that. So that, I guess, I would assume is probably a question for Mr. Zur, but obviously he's not here tonight.
May I address that a minute? Okay. The only reason we had 82% is because of people that are either in nursing homes or snowbirds in there. I only had one actual person that refused to sign, the ballot. All the others we couldn't reach. Otherwise, we'd have had a lot higher percentage.
I would just think that we would want some type of agreement with you all, that you understand that there are times when we're going to have to come on to what either is in the MOU or document that people are going to have to come on from time to time to repair a street light. They're going to be working around your yard and doing some work and that kind of thing. We just don't want somebody.
And we have discussed that with Mr. Zur and have reached an agreement, I think, with him that he's satisfied, with that. In addition, we have also told our residents that because we're still going to plow clean driveways and their sidewalks, because we've been doing that anyway. So as an association, we're still going to continue to do that. We're just going to piggyback on when Public Works makes their first pass, then we'll come in behind it. And we've told our residents that in the event yards get tore up, et cetera, we would resod the spots for the resident. So we think we've tried to address, that issue and that concern.
Thank you.
Mr. Berenson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And somebody had mentioned, I'm going to go back on the high back versus rollback. And there were a couple other reasons, and initially I insisted on two things. I wanted to make sure that they followed city standards and used the aggregate that we use, and they agreed to that. I also initially was insistent or persuasive that we go to the high back curb because the city has mandated that. But in looking at their streets and driving through their neighborhood and listening to some of their concerns, one of which is, A, they don't have sidewalks and don't want them. Their yards are smaller than most in the city, and if you do put a sidewalk in, you're going to take up about a quarter to a third of their yard. And second, most of the residents don't want the sidewalks to begin with. Those that do walk, they typically walk on the street, and they don't want a high back curb. It's a little bit of a safety concern. They can walk on and off the yard with the rollback curb. It's a little bit easier on them. And so that's why I kind of came around to the idea of keeping the rollback, not only for aesthetics, but it's a little bit of a safety concern due to the fact that the neighborhood, their average age is in their 70s. Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else? Mr. Kellogg.
to dovetail off of what Jay said, you know, I have that same concern that Jay did, and thank you for the answer. But to the extent of full disclosure in question is that, just like in my front yard, the sidewalk to the street is city property. You know, I maintain it as my yard. I feel it's my yard, but in all reality, that is city property. That's not really, I don't consider that a setback or an easement. That is actually public property. And that's a question that I would want staff to answer as to how far from the middle of the street back are we the city getting that would be public property. So I don't want somebody to have a misgiving or a misconception as to what is going to happen, you know, because it's very frustrating. It was very frustrating for me and very frustrating for many of my neighbors when they found out that our utility easements comes within 3 foot of our front door, you know, and that's stuff that we don't think about, you know, and I want to make sure that the folks think about that stuff if it's the reality of the situation. And then I'll leave that. I've got a few more, but I thank Mr. Holman for bringing it up to jog my memory.
To address that point, in conversations we've had with Mr. Zur, that we are giving a 10-foot easement for the primary, like the purposes that when they plow snow, they've got that much room to pile if we get any big snows like we had, 4 or 5 years ago. So we've agreed to a 10-foot easement, you know, for that purpose of snow and drainage and removal.
Mr. Holman?
Thank you, sir. I would commend you. Obviously, you've done a very good job. It's been very organized, overwhelming support out of your group. I'm generally in support of this. One thing I would provide is a cautionary tale, as I did to the Cemetery Association. You will draw the benefit of the city, you know, preparing or maintaining the streets and the infrastructure and plowing and that kind of stuff. You give up the right of private streets. So if there is some teenage kid that drives down through there absent a code or traffic violation, you don't have the right to call the police and have them removed as trespassers anymore, because people do have that right to walk down your streets that are no longer members of your neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure you've thought of that, but that's maybe just something to remind everybody. I know it's annoying when a very loud car goes by my house at 3 a.m. in the morning. Unfortunately, it's a public street and they have the right to do that. So.
One of the advantages I think we have in that sense is that there's no businesses
that's true.
in there, so there's no attraction.
Sure.
You know, for them really at that point in time.
Sure.
Plus, we also have a policy, and it's kind of our understanding that we can continue to maintain that policy, and that we have a 48-hour parking limit on the streets. People are otherwise required to keep their vehicles on their driveway or in their garage, and if it's more than 48 hours, you know, we can ask them to, you know, stay off of that. So that kind of keeps them off of the low curbs, going back to your issue there a minute ago, in there. So we think that will not be that much of a problem, since there's not much reason to be coming down our streets, you know, anyway, more so than what they currently have, because most of the commercial situations are at J and 58, you know, there, and then going up to Sunrise and 58 on the other end.
Yes, sir.
There.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cullen?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And reminiscing back about almost 9 years ago, 8.5, 9 years, I remember the council at that time took on an issue. It was the trash issue. And part of the exemptions for any neighborhood that was wanting to opt out of the contract of the trash removal was that if they maintain their own infrastructures, meaning the lights, the streets, the pump stations and that. And we had, I believe, three neighborhoods or 3 areas that did opt out of that. And it was Morning View, I believe Walnut Estates, and Foxwood Springs. And the justification and the consensus of the council back in those days was that if they were to maintain those infrastructures, that they could opt out of the compulsory contract. That is the policy of the council. I was on that council at that time, and I remember those discussions very well, but I have not heard any talk of this. And I would definitely advocate the will of the council policy that be followed through with. And I just want that to be well known. And, you know, if there's any input or any concerns, please let me know. Let us know, let the council know.
The conversations that we've had with Mr. Feuerborn was that with the issues that came about with your new trash contractor, et cetera, that they would prefer at this time we not, you know, come under the city contract. And that we would just, because right now in our due structure, we pay for trash removal, you know, when our residents pay their monthly dues, their trash, you know, is in there. One of the issues we had is that we talked with the city staff about was how to pay for that. I know right now, you know, trash bills get added to water bills, and yet we're collecting the bill from, you know, from the homeowner. We said, hey, let us just write the city one check for all 191 homes, whether somebody's in that home or not. And that became an issue or something that the city didn't feel or staff didn't feel they could do it. So they finally said, okay, we'll let you, you know, continue to provide privately, you know, for trash removal.
Mr. Olin.
Thanks. One thing, Mr. Kellogg, that may be at issue here, when we did the contract with that company, their homes were not included. So I don't know if that's affected, how that's affected. So I see their point, and that makes sense, at least at this point in time, for them to keep their trash service to me, and then maybe in the future you join our conglomerate under a contract.
We're more than willing to look at it, you know, as we go down the road. I mean, that's not a deal breaker in that sense for us.
Okay. So Bill, go ahead.
Also, to kind of add to that, some of the conversation that we had when we were talking about the trash had to do with the fact that this group provides additional services to the residents of Morning View. Because most of the people there are 70 or older, they have people who aren't able to roll the big carts down to the curb. They have people that aren't even able to carry their trash bags to the curb. So they have worked out with their trash service that they have certain houses where they will go pick up the trash from up by the garage doors, and, you know, whether it's in the bin or whether it's just a bag. So because they provide with their trash service currently some services that we wouldn't be able to provide with ours, that was another important piece in that conversation.
Go ahead, Mr. Kellogg.
I'm checking off my questions. The street signs, are they in compliance and uniform with what the rest of the city has? I remember when we took over the street there between Orchlands and McDonald's, the street signs were not, first of all, they were the wrong color. And then I remember back on my P&Z days is that when the UDO came about, it got so detailed that we hashed out the size of the letters that are on the signs. That way it was uniform, it was easily legible and easy to read from a certain distance. That's my concern there, is that those street signs, what will we have to do in regards to those?
Mr. Holman?
I think maybe I can answer that. I have a little bit of background in signage from my work. I've spent more money on signs than you probably spent on your house, but I was spending somebody else's money when I did it. Signage is controlled typically at the government level by a document known as the MUTCD, Manual for Uniform Traffic Control Devices. It sets the size of a stop sign, size of the letters, the color, depending upon speed of the road, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So most signs that are in there are probably going to be MUTCD compliant. I doubt that's an issue. What you're referring to was the street name signs, green versus brown. Even if they were fully non-compliant, in the scheme of things, signs are pretty cheap. They really are. They're not very much. So to me, that's not a big issue. It's a valid concern. I understand. It's just, That's, in the scheme of this, to me, is pretty minor. But I would say most all those signs are probably going to be good to go.
Did you have something?
Yeah, our street signs have already been compliant. We've had that approved by Mr. Fairborn.
Okay,
Yeah, he's already mentioned that all street signs are compliant.
okay. Anything else? That's it? Mr. Barber?
Again, I just want to say, going through your neighborhood, you guys have a beautiful neighborhood. You've taken very good care of it. And from what I've seen right here, I know we may have some few fine details to work out, but I don't really see any from my side, any issues at all. And I think I could support this.
Thank you.
Well, if there's nothing else, go ahead, Ms. Abdel-Gani.
I was just going to say one more thing. If we're wrapping up, I want to thank you guys, all of you, for coming. Obviously, this is very important to your neighborhood. You all came out to support this. I know that your board has worked really hard with the city, with Mr. Berenson and me to get this all worked out. It was a very great presentation. All the details are here. Like, you know, everything's done. A few little questions still to figure out, and I think we're moving in the right direction. And thank you guys for all your work and the excellent presentation tonight.
Just want to thank you all again very much for letting us appear here tonight and make our presentation, and look forward to working with you as we go down the road.
Okay, thank you. Just to let you know, though, it probably won't get on the next agenda. The March 26th agenda looks like it's going to be, it might not occur because of the meeting. We've got both Ward 4 members won't be here from your ward, so we'll probably push that to the first meeting in April, and that'll give us one more work session to kind of smooth through some of these minor items that have been brought up tonight.
Okay. Should we be back here for that in case we need to answer any questions?
Yeah, I would suggest that you be
Okay.
back here for that
Okay.
one. If we have it on the work session, you can be here for that, but I would definitely be here for the council meeting.
Okay, thank
Okay.
you very much.
All right.
Okay, we'll do that.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Next on our agenda is the Administrative Policy Manual.
Okay, this I actually know something about. I don't know, we'll leave it up there. We'll leave it up there.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it. Good seeing Okay, I think we can proceed now. The Administrative Policy Manual.
And to...
Riveting.
Hey, come on. And to the point of the last item, too, any other questions, if you all think of something, later, I took as many notes as I possibly could, and I'll be putting those into a document for Mr. Fairborn to discuss, obviously, with Mr. Cataret, Mr. Krass, and Mr. Zur at a later time. But if you all think of anything else, I know Mr. Fairborn would encourage you all to send any questions, thoughts, concerns about this item directly to him so that he can make sure that those get addressed. As the mayor indicated, for further discussion, since, obviously he would want to make sure, before it actually got on an actual agenda that all of those issues were addressed, any questions that you all had. So thank you very, very much. Okay, the Administrative Policy Manual you have had for the last couple of weeks, 500 and 600, and we will do this basically as we did it before, and any questions, concerns, I have, or Sean and I both have, in our copy of the manual, or these sections of the manual, just some, things that were changed. Again, this version of, what will be distributed to employees when they're hired looks nothing like the hundreds and hundreds of pages that in our existing manual. And as we move forward, you all have had the first read of 100 through 400. Now we're now getting into some of the, more serious sections of the policy, much more to procedure, FMLA, and those types of things that are in our policy. Employee health and safety, obviously compensation, things like sick time, vacation time, and things like that. So I won't go through section by section because you all could get out of here pretty quick. But if anybody has any questions, I know Mr. Fearborn had made the same offer when he sent out these two segments of the policy, that if anyone had any questions to forward any and all of those to him. So I'm happy to answer anything that you all might have tonight.
It's really not that voluminous, and hopefully you've had an opportunity to take a look at it. Has anybody got any questions about anything that's in there right now? Mr. Townsend.
I had a quick question under paragraph 601, paragraph D, regarding service.
I'm sorry, you said D, sir?
D,
Yes,
yes.
sir.
That last sentence in there regarding in general, an employee who is rehired after a lapse of service is considered a new employee. What's defined as a lapse? Is it 24 hours, 30 days?
Actually, Sean, don't we?
30 days.
30 days?
Yeah.
It's 30
Okay.
days.
Is that defined in anywhere later in the manual, or?
I don't believe so, and we certainly could add that. I mean,
Yes,
that would be
I see.
easy enough to
Okay.
make sure that that's clarified, so.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else?
Okay.
Mr. Holman.
Just one, this is under, well, it's actually kind of a generalistic question under section 500. It is addressed a little bit in 500.5. It talks about drug testing, and then there's a reference that says section 400.7 is the drug and alcohol-free workplace. Generalistic question, what is the city's policy on drug testing? Can we random test an employee at any given time? Does there have to be cause?
Actually, all of the above. We still do random testing, and seems like some people's name come up more often than others. I don't really understand that. Sean controls that, but we random test, but we also have for-cause testing, reasonable suspicion testing, depending on, that employee's involvement in, some type of incident or event. You may have noticed a change in the policy with regard to vehicular accidents, where that is not necessarily mandate a drug test, as we have always done in the past. That's a change in policy because, we felt, and in the discussions with management team and HR and the attorneys, that an individual in the middle of their shift, in the middle of the day, gets rear-ended, out on the street, doing their job, that we're going to take lots of people out of service to mandate a drug test. So we're using a little more common sense with regard to not taking people out of service to do, I know you suffered under that for years.
I complained about that for years.
For years under that, but if in conjunction with a supervisor and HR, we feel like there was some sort of negligence on the part of the employee involved in that accident, then we most certainly are going to send them if we feel like the circumstances warrant that. And I'm sorry, Sean, you were going to say something, or did I just talk all over you?
Pretty much. I was just going to say that we also obviously we drug test all employees coming in too. And then the random drug testing is done by a third-party administrator.
I saw, it was just, I thought a little odd at first read employee health and safety and some of the things you touch on, it's not in here. I say, well, okay, it's tied back to section 400. So I answered it, but we already passed that section. I just couldn't remember exactly if that's listed in there, so.
Well, and as Mayor Turnbow will attest, that has always been a bee in my bonnet about having to take, several police officers out of service to go be drug tested when, that they get rear-ended in the parking lot at Walmart and they're not at fault, and, now I have to take them out of service and that sort of thing. So that is going to be a little more common sense, I think, going forward.
Mr. Kellen?
Thank you. And I had this this question came up, I failed to ask it last time because it was in there with the drug testing and that. And, but my question is how does that look? How does that work? What does that look like as it works is what I'm really asking. If supervisor has a suspicion or a accident happens that necessitates a drug test or, you know, a testing, how does that work? Staff has said, you know, that we send them to get tested. If there's suspicion, and I know that I'm talking to somebody that, but I don't know because it doesn't tell me. How does that employee get to the testing? Or do they, I don't want to assume that they drive themselves.
No, absolutely, yeah.
That's where I'm going with this. That's what I want to hear.
And that is a lot of what you see, and we've talked about in sections 1 through 400 as well. Procedural parts of the policy, what you're seeing is the overarching policy. We have drug testing, you know, we have a drug-free workplace. The procedural part of the policy, like how they get there, I will assure you that nobody drives themselves, but, and that was the reason that, you know, we took so much issue with it. I know in the police department, I can speak for Mr. Crass, I think in Public Works as well, when we had to take, you know, both the officer out of service, and again, I'll just speak for the police department, we'd have to take the officer out of service and a supervisor to drive them there, and so now I've taken 2 people off the street so that, because we would never allow someone to drive themselves to that drug test, whether it's reasonable suspicion. Now, if it's a random drug test, we allow the employee to go, you know, to go to the third-party vendor and take the drug test. But if it's involving anything, an accident or reasonable suspicion or anything that has happened that would prompt us to send an employee for a drug test, they're not allowed to go on their own.
Anything else? Okay. Everybody good with it?
All right, you all will, in much the same manner that we have done before, is you'll see at next week's meeting, well, if there is a meeting.
If there is one.
If there is one next week. If there's a meeting next week, you'll see sections 100 through 400 for second read. You'll see 500 and 600 for first read. And then 700 and 800 will be sent to you prior to your next work session, so you'll have a chance to see, you know, spend some time digesting 700 and 800, and then that's it. There are only 800 sections in the policy manual, and I know. 800 sections.
In the old format, yes, that would have been it.
Yeah, it's hundreds of pages
It's like
in the old one, But then after the council obviously approves, you know, all of these sections of policy, you know, additional work begins with, and not begins, that's not really appropriate, but continues with the procedural parts of what has come out of the overarching policy manual. So those SOPs, you know, things that talk about, you know, how the person gets down to be drug tested, are all in, and all of the things that Sean is responsible for, of which is voluminous, you know, in hiring and posting jobs and things like that, that didn't need to be in this manual, but they're procedural in nature, and those things are happening at department, you know, much like the police department SOP, you know, is a lot of information, obviously not contained here, but, and that is happening in departments all throughout the city, so. Fortunately, y'all don't have to see that.
Okay.
That's all I have. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. If there's nothing else, anyone? We're adjourned.